It felt like the weight of all that built-up tension was craving a resolution, a response, and without a second thought, I allowed my hand to softly brush against his. It felt like an unspoken assurance that all was well to proceed. He hesitated briefly, as though he grasped the significance of the message, and then moved even nearer. The warmth radiating from him wrapped around me, igniting a heartbeat that surged with an intensity one had never known. "David," I uttered in a voice that felt strangely unfamiliar to me. Following that moment, silence reigned supreme. The quiet enveloped us, punctuated solely by our gestures, our touches, and the seamless connection that our bodies appeared to share. The course of my life shifted dramatically the night my father, in an unfortunate mix-up, entered the wrong room and settled beside me, convinced I was my mother. This moment began in an unusual way, ultimately veering into a direction I could never have anticipated. To help you grasp the situation, let me take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Chloe, 22 years old, and I currently reside with my parents. David, aged 52, and Sarah, aged 49. Our dwelling may be simple, yet it brims with the rhythm of daily life. My parents share a traditional marriage where weekends hold a sacred significance, reserved for moments spent together, uncorking a bottle, and engaging in conversations that meander through everything and nothing all at once. Yet, that night, nothing felt quite right. Perhaps it differs in your home, but in mine, the weekends consistently unfolded in the same way. My father and mother lounged on the sofa in the living room, glasses in hand, sharing laughter over the simplest of things. It felt akin to a sacred tradition for them. Following a grueling week of toil, when Saturday finally dawned, it felt as though the universe could collapse, provided there was revelry and cheer. I found it quite amusing and a bit foreseeable. I was aware that, ultimately, my mother would retreat to her room with a cheerful demeanor, while my father would navigate the hallways in a somewhat clumsy manner. Ultimately, it all boiled down to the rhythm of my daily life. I would observe from a distance, chuckle softly, and then return to my world on my phone or computer. As time passed, I found myself paying closer attention to their behavior. I observed that my dad became significantly more talkative after having a few drinks. He wasn't one to indulge in daily drinking, yet when he did partake, his words flowed more freely than usual. My mother found it charming, whereas I, to be frank, merely regarded it as intriguing. For a few hours, it felt as though he had transformed into someone entirely different. That night held a certain uniqueness. It occurred on the previous Saturday. The living room was their familiar setting, as always. Yet my father appeared unusually animated, speaking with fervor and recounting tales from his bachelor days, while my mother simply chuckled. As I busied myself in the kitchen, crafting a snack, my ears were irresistibly drawn to his every word. He would express sentiments such as, "Oh, it was because I was the man, and Sarah, you captivated me because you had a knack for driving me wild." I found myself there, chuckling to myself, as my father shared his jokes, those moments that left you in a delightful quandary of whether to laugh or feel a twinge of embarrassment. Following lunch, I retreated to my room and secured the door behind me. Do you ever sense that a change is on the horizon? Words failed to capture the essence, yet that was the depth of my emotions that night. Perhaps it was the way my father raised his voice more than normal, or maybe it was simply that I finally focused on his actions during these instances. This notion lingered in my mind, even as I attempted to divert my attention by scrolling through videos on my phone. I began to ponder whether my parents engaged in those wild discussions during my childhood. Have they consistently shared everything with one another? In that moment, it was as if I was unearthing a facet of their being that had previously escaped my attention. My father, especially, was always a serious and methodical man in my eyes, yet with a glass in his hand, he transformed into an almost entirely different version of himself. That night, an unusual curiosity stirred within me, compelling me to delve deeper into this aspect of him. As I prepared to drift off, I caught my mother softly speaking about retreating to her room, the hour growing late. My father, naturally, stayed in the living room, caught in the haze of the television and the bottle. I switched off the light, yet slumber eluded me for a while, contemplating how these instances can unveil facets that often escape our attention in the rhythm of everyday life. It was a casual, seemingly haphazard notion, yet one that would gain importance in due course, for ultimately, that evening would transform into something far beyond a typical Saturday. I was not aware of that until now. It was a Saturday just like any other. My parents filled the living room with laughter, relishing their weekend beer and high spirits. They often enjoyed sitting on the couch, reminiscing about stories and discussing past events. It felt like a sacred tradition, a moment of respite from the burdens that had accumulated throughout the week. This time, my father appeared to be unusually at ease. He had indulged a bit too much, and his voice reverberated throughout the house. Even my mother, who had always walked alongside him at this pace, chose to depart before he did. With a smile, she bid farewell and ascended to her room, leaving my father solitary in the living room. As I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. The open window allowed my father's laughter to drift in, intertwining with the background hum of the television. As I scrolled through my phone, lost in thought, I envisioned how deeply he was savoring that moment, almost entirely detached from reality. With the passage of time, an oppressive silence settled over the house. The only noise that pierced the silence was the weighty thud of his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Suddenly, without warning, something compelled me to halt. A sense of anticipation washed over me, as if I could sense that something unusual was on the verge of unfolding. Perhaps it's a sense of intuition, or merely my thoughts drifting away. Without warning, the door to my room creaked open, inch by inch. It struck me as odd, considering that typically no one enters my room without first knocking. As I glanced over, there stood my father, wearing that familiar, somewhat bewildered expression, grasping the door as though he were searching for a path forward. For a fleeting instant, I contemplated inquiring about his desires, yet I restrained my inquisitiveness. He moved ahead and proclaimed, his voice slightly trembling, "Sarah, I have arrived." In that instant, my heart pounded fiercely. He was utterly convinced that he had stepped into my mother's room. Initially, I felt compelled to caution him that he had ventured into the wrong territory. Yet, a force held me back. I stayed quiet, merely observing as he, bewildered, perched on the edge of the bed. He was completely lost. He simply nestled beside me and let out a sigh as though he longed for slumber. I stood still, attempting to understand the unfolding events. My heart pounded so fiercely that it echoed in the silence. Simultaneously, a strange curiosity stirred within me, as if I was compelled to discover just how far the situation might unfold. My heart raced as he nestled into bed, utterly unaware that he was not in my mother's room. I stood frozen, struggling to comprehend the unfolding scene. Yet, a peculiar notion started to take shape in my thoughts. What if I chose to remain silent? What if I allowed him to think he was with my mother, just for the sake of amusement? He never meant for it to escalate, merely seeking to gauge their responses. It may appear to be without purpose. In that instant, it felt as though the circumstances beckoned me to engage in a game with an uncertain outcome. Rather than pointing out his error, I chose to embrace the amusement of the moment. "Is that you, David?" He spoke, imitating the gentle cadence of my mother's voice. He faced me, his eyelids nearly shut, straining to perceive in the shadows. I stifled a chuckle. He truly thought I was her. "Is that you, Sarah?" he inquired with a lingering tone. "It's me, darling," I responded with the most persuasive tone I could summon. He exhaled deeply, sinking into a state of ease, as though the weight of existence had been removed from his back. I found myself standing there, relishing the moment. It was amusing to observe how utterly disoriented he was, completely oblivious to anything unusual around him. For a brief instant, he reached for my hand, but I evaded it just enough, stifling a laugh within. He muttered something about the exhausting day he'd endured, expressing a deep desire for rest. I seized the chance to initiate a dialogue, feigning the role of my mother. It seems you put in a lot of effort today, didn't you? A well-deserved pause is in order. He smiled slightly, his eyes still closed, nodding in agreement with the soft murmur. It was peculiar, yet I found pleasure in observing how at ease he appeared in that setting. He was aware that it was unwise, yet there was an undeniable allure in manipulating the scenario while keeping him completely oblivious. We lingered in this moment for a few minutes. He uttered a jumble of words, and I replied in a manner reminiscent of my mother, as though we were performing in an unscripted drama where my primary objective was to mislead my father without his awareness. The sensation of mastery, of commanding that moment, was nearly intoxicating. I knew all too well that I wouldn't follow through with this. It was merely a game, a way to fill the hours and delve into an extraordinary scenario. Yet, in that instant, I couldn't help but acknowledge that it was more enjoyable than anything else that had transpired within those walls. As each moment passed, the scenario grew increasingly captivating. My father lay beside me, convinced he was with my mother, and I found myself with the perfect chance to engage with it. A playful challenge, merely to gauge his boundaries, as well as my own. "Feeling a bit worn out today, darling?" I inquired in the gentlest, most tender tone I could muster, channeling my mother's essence. He shifted his gaze in my direction, his eyelids nearly shut, and released a soft chuckle. "A touch, yet your presence brings me ease." That caught me off guard for a brief moment. He found himself completely absorbed in the game, oblivious to everything else around him. It was nearly amusing. I offered a sideways smile and chose to venture a bit further. "You truly deserve this, don't you? You put in so much effort, and it seems like you never truly take a break," I remarked softly, my fingers gliding down his arm. It may have been small, yet it was sufficient for him to perceive the gesture and respond. "Indeed, you always seem to understand my needs," he remarked, releasing another sigh as if he were shedding the burdens of the entire day. I nestled deeper into the bed, positioning myself just right to heighten the intrigue, maintaining a deliberate distance yet close enough to sense his awareness, even in that moment. "You've been quite on edge, haven't you?" I carried on, my voice imbued with a gentle charm. "You really should prioritize your well-being and spend more time unwinding with me." He offered a faint smile, and I sensed the very air in the room shifting around us. The stakes were high, yet I felt a sense of mastery over the situation. I could cease at any time, yet I found myself unwilling to do so, at least for now. "Sarah," he whispered, tilting his face toward me, as if a deeper sentiment lingered on the tip of his tongue, yet the words eluded him. "Hello, darling. How are you?" I inquired, leaning in a bit, my voice laced with playful banter. "Feel free to express yourself. I have arrived." He shook his head, a soft chuckle escaping his lips, a hint of embarrassment coloring his expression. Heat surged to my cheeks, yet I stayed put in the room. It was captivating to observe the lengths he would reach, and despite its oddity, it brought a sense of enjoyment for me. I glided my fingers softly over the sheet, feigning a drawing motion, merely to introduce a touch of dynamism and gauge his response, which he indeed provided. He extended his hand toward mine, yet paused in uncertainty. "It's all right, David," I murmured softly. "Rest assured, I will look after you." The game continued on its course. I was enjoying myself and engaging with the situation while keeping everything in check. It felt like I was performing in a play, orchestrating each line and movement, while he, without realizing it, adhered to the script flawlessly. I endeavored to maintain control over the situation, yet an unsettling change was beginning to stir within me. The tension of that moment ignited a spark within me that I had never realized was there. My heart raced, and each of his movements felt imbued with deeper significance. His touches remained gentle, yet there was an unmistakable shift in the way his hand moved over my arm and shoulder. The touch was tentative, yet it carried an intensity that thickened the atmosphere around us. I remained still, yet my breath quickened, and I was acutely aware that he could see it. "Sarah, you seem so transformed today," he breathed softly, his voice low and husky, nearly a whisper. I knew I should have halted right then, But in that instant, a part of me chose to surrender to the urge to stop fighting. It felt like the weight of all that built-up tension was seeking resolution, a response, and without a second thought, I allowed my hand to softly brush against his, a quiet gesture signaling that it was all right to move forward. He hesitated briefly, as though the message resonated with him, and then moved in even closer. The warmth radiating from him wrapped around me, causing my heart to race in an unfamiliar rhythm. "Dear David," I spoke in a voice that felt foreign to me. Following that moment, words ceased to exist. Silence enveloped us, filled solely with gestures, touches, and the seamless rhythm of our bodies in unison. It felt as though everything was beyond our grasp, yet somehow it was perfectly aligned for that moment. Time seemed to stand still, enveloping everything in a singular moment that felt eternal. In that instant, I understood that everything was about to shift irrevocably, yet all I could focus on was the warmth enveloping me, the intimacy shared, and the undeniable sensation of stepping over a threshold from which there was no turning back. As the chaos subsided, I found myself lying next to him, attuned to the steady rhythm of his breath, while the weight of the events we had just experienced slowly settled in. My mind swirled with a jumble of thoughts and emotions that remained elusive, yet I was acutely conscious that everything would change after that night.